Welcome to From Days to Years. I'm your host, Angie Lee, and I'm here with my special guest, Jessica Wright. Jessica is a mom, an advocate, and a teacher. And I'd just like Jessica to introduce herself and tell you a little bit more about who she is and what she does. Jessica?
Yeah. So thank you so much for having me, Angie. I really appreciate it. I'll never pass up the opportunity to talk about kids and education, which you know. Grew up, in our public school system, graduated locally, and we're raising our kids here as well. And they are in, their neighborhood school. And I'm also a teacher. So I have, kind of a dual perspective as both a mom with their kids in school, as well as an educator. And so I do work as well in the field of advocacy with various different organizations, really just making sure that kids have what they need and that teachers are supported to actually provide what the kids need.
Which is awesome. We need more people like that,
Yeah.
especially in this day and age. So, on today's show or this month, we're talking about education from the perspective of a parent. And I'm sure you've had many experiences, and I've had many experiences being in the education system. And our kids are not older, but they're relatively young. So that's the frame that we're working with is kids in elementary or middle school kind of years, not high school, not necessarily college. So that's the perspectives we're speaking from today. So given that introduction, just a basic overview of what do you think the differences are between charter, public, and private? Because this is the time of year when people start to question their school choice. Should my kid be in public school? Would they be better in private school? Should I go to charter school or even remote learning?
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a great question. And I think ultimately it's what's the best decision for that specific family. I don't think that there's necessarily a one size fits all, especially since we know that all of our kids have different unique needs. And a lot of things that have changed in the state of Florida in the last 2 years that has really changed what schools are able to provide, regardless of what their specific title is. And so within the public school system, that also includes charter schools now. And a lot of people do not realize that there are different credentials, requirements, and things like that that they will have to go through in order to both establish themselves as a charter school. And there are additional requirements that our traditional public schools go through that charters don't necessarily have to do. And then when you add private school into the mix, it can get even a little bit more confusing in terms of how things work behind the scenes when it comes to funding, testing regulations, making sure that students are provided with, access to ESC services. And, previously, 10 years ago or so, a lot of times people would speak poorly of private schools or even charter schools, depending on if they were truly serving those children. Now, we can see that happen in any type of avenue, any type of school offering. However, the proof is in the pudding in terms of what are the parents and the students saying that their child is actually being provided. And what we have now is that there are several private schools who are specifically focused on serving our ESE students. And that's one of the biggest game changers that we've seen evolve over the last 10 years. And there's a lot of conversation and frankly some controversial, especially for those who work within education, is if how the funding is allocated, how parents are able to get access to that funding for their child. And one of the biggest concerns is that if your child is not able to be served in a public school, especially because of their ESE needs,
Now,
where does that
so
child go?
not everyone knows what an ESE. So there are different types of students who go to schools. ESE is what? I mean, I know what ESE is, but could you please explain? So people, because
Sure.
they don't
So
know
ESE
what
is the is the terminology we use for exceptional student education. And so to further narrow that down, it's our students with disabilities.
that is.
And really the way that I prefer to frame that is that students that learn differently. And
Mhm,
so when we're talking about those students with unique abilities, it doesn't necessarily mean that our students with disabilities could not learn at high levels. It
mhm,
just means that they learn differently in order to access that academic information and that instructional time.
So, so with public schools, charter schools, private schools, and remote learning environments or schools, because there are co-ops as well, it depends on your child. So you're talking about more about like, ESC children, children with unique needs, special needs, children who are typically like autistic, high functioning, or mild to moderate functioning. Could be kids with ADHD, could be kids who are wheelchair bound, um, but those or neurodivergent children. But from the perspective of parents who, because that's those are two different worlds, two completely different worlds. But from the perspective of parents who do not have ESE kids, would you say what is the difference between a private school, public school, charter school, or remote learning environment for the quote unquote typical child? Again, no child is typical. Every child is different. Even within
Yeah.
families, children are different.
Yes,
Talk
for
about that.
sure. For sure.
But from the typical parent standpoint, what are the differences in private schools, public schools, charter schools, remote learning for a typical child?
So I think that it really depends on the specific school. And I say that because our traditional public schools really are not traditional anymore. We've tried to become accustomed to the different magnet schools that are offered, whether we focus on science and math or whether we focus on art. So you might have, excuse me, a neighborhood school that still provides all of this additional enrichment that within the public system you can still choice into, right? So,
Mhm,
like, we're in our current choice window where even though your child may be zoned for the school down the road, maybe
mhm,
there's another public school that has additional offerings that you're interested in that you think would be the best fit for your child. Now, you can do that same thing with a charter school, which then the child would be chosen through a lottery, or you can also do that through a private school in which you would have to apply. Oftentimes, they go through an application process that will include an interview. And like you had mentioned, we also have homeschool co ops
mhm,
where parents will use different online learning platforms or different curriculum. And then they will also potentially meet face to face for different activities to help build social skills. And so it's really hard to drill in and answer those questions that isn't focused on really the behind the scenes factor, because most of the differences are going to come with how funding is allocated and dispersed, which I know that that's not what most parents are interested in, right? They're interested
mhm,
in what's going to be offered to their child. And so when I'm talking with parents and they're trying to figure out what the best fit for their student is,
mhm,
it really comes down to what's offered within a reasonable geographic location.
mhm,
Where can you get your kid, in the morning and in the afternoon? What's going to be realistic for you as a family? And
mhm,
what do you think that your child needs? If your child thrives in a mainstream classroom with traditional education and learning, that's great. If you feel that your child needs something different, though, then you might look into a public choice option or potentially a public charter or a private school. And so the biggest difference and things that I encourage parents to look out for when
mhm,
they're trying to find that best fit is asking questions like, well, how long has your staff been here? What
mhm,
does turnover look like for you? Especially in Florida, where we have the largest shortage in every single education position
yeah,
throughout the nation. So, asking those questions about staff is really important.
mhm,
Asking the administrators questions about, well, what is the culture here? What are there things that you value as administrators that you're then passing on to your staff and your
mhm,
students and your families?
mhm,
Because that can really change whether it's
mhm,
public school to public school
mhm,
or whether it's private to private. And so it really comes down to, what does the staff believe in? What's
mhm,
the culture of the school? And how
mhm,
do they plan to implement those teaching strategies to the,
mhm.
for the best situation for your child?
And that's a great way of saying that, asking those questions. Those are great questions to ask. The other thing I'd want to know is for parents, there are certain, I don't want to say overreaches, but the government will play a role in certain types of schools. So public school, charter school, or there are more mandates or testing requirements coming from the government versus private. They have a little bit more leeway as to what they can do and what they can't do, and what they can teach and what they can't teach. Also, the certification of teachers. I've heard that, and this may be true. I don't know. Like, we used to live in a different state. Now we're living in Florida. That not necessarily private school teachers don't necessarily have to have all the same credentials as public school teachers, and they can have distant different testing requirements in public school versus private school, and
Mhm.
also charter school. I don't know, is that true? You know more about
So
education.
yeah, so that is true. There's
Okay,
an element of it though that I feel is really misleading.
okay,
And right now, something that we're not talking about enough, and again is connected to the shortage, is that the state of Florida has changed the certification requirements for our teachers. So
okay.
you can be actively teaching in a classroom without having a college degree, and you have 5 years to finish that degree and obtain your professional certification.
That's in public, charter, and private across the board, or just in public and charter?
So that's across the board because the certification process is managed by the Department of Education.
Okay.
And so I bring that up because we have public schools, charter
Mhm.
schools, private schools, they're all hiring people who are what we call out of field, which basically means they don't have a certification.
So this
Now,
could have been like an engineer, and then they decided, you know what? I want to go back to the classroom and maybe impart some of the knowledge that I have and skills that I have to help the next generation, that kind of thing?
it could. We do actually have some teachers right now who are listed as an instructional assistant, but they
Mhm,
are a full-time teacher in the classroom. And some of them are very young and they have not finished college yet.
mhm,
And I want to be clear too that we have a lot of good intentioned people in our
mhm,
classrooms, whether that's any type of offering, public charter or private. However, the difference though, for someone who's truly been trained to be a teacher, who's
mhm,
gone through that education and continued training and professional development, it
mhm.
does make a difference. And so go ahead.
What kind of training would you specifically get as a teacher? Like, I so a little background. Technically, my degree is engineering. Technically, that's what I graduated with, but I wanted to be a teacher. In my 3rd year at college, my father told me, "No, you're gonna continue on to be an engineer." I'm like, "No, I wanna be a teacher. I think I'd be a great teacher. I wanna help the kids in the classroom." He told me no. And so I did not fill out the rest of my application for the School of Education at U of M. I continued to be an engineer. And I always wondered, like, what kind of training do you get as a teacher? Like, do you how to deal with classroom disruptions, how to teach kids? Is it literally how to teach, or is it
Mhm.
just how to teach math, or is it how to teach math to kids on different types of kids? Like, what kind of training are the professionals who are going into the industry now that don't have that certification, what are they missing?
Yeah. So I think one of the things to talk about too with that is for every 5 teachers that leave the profession, we're
Mhm.
only seeing one come into it. So our
Okay.
enrollment levels for our College of Education across the nation, it varies between 30 and 40% depending on the location, right? However, so like for me personally, I majored in social science education and
Mhm.
pre-law, and I have my master's in educational leadership.
Nice.
I'm also a state certified, what they call clinical educator mentor. So I help train new teachers.
Oh, okay, good.
So,
For
so as a
training you?
part of my degree of study, we had several observation hours that we needed to complete within classrooms.
Yeah.
We also had to complete several internships where we were actively teaching. We
Mhm.
were paired up with a veteran teacher who would then mentor us, give us specific feedback, both about the content and classroom management. The
Okay.
other thing that I really appreciated during my time, during my undergrad, was how much we had to take in educational psychology, which sometimes people don't realize is even a thing or a class.
Yeah.
But let me tell you how much it helps with classroom management
Yeah.
because when you approach discipline or classroom
Mhm.
management through mutual respect and understanding that that student is a person, which sounds so silly, but whatever happened before they walked in the door
Yeah.
matters for what they're able to mentally and emotionally access in your classroom.
That's right.
And so having that frame of mind and frame of reference, I think is really important. And
Mhm.
that's why I see that we're hiring a lot of really well-intentioned people, but if you
Mhm.
haven't gone through those years of training, you simply just don't know what you don't know. And part of the concern that I have, and this is really universally in public, charter, and private, is
Mhm.
how much are we really training the people that we have in the building, right? We can't go back in time. We
Yeah.
can't necessarily change the teacher shortage at this point. We are where we are. So,
Yeah.
what are the solutions to really address those gaps in knowledge and ability to make sure we're improving the dynamic? But to
Mhm.
answer your initial question in terms of private schools hiring out of field teachers, yes, that is true.
Mhm.
However, I don't think that, and I haven't read anywhere that it is now at a higher rate than
Mhm.
public schools. I
Mhm.
think what we're seeing is pretty equal across the board because of how significant the shortage is.
Yeah.
To respond to your question about testing,
Mhm.
private schools can elect to opt in for that state testing or not.
Okay.
And the other piece of that, I will say, is there's also testing that we administer as a public district
Mhm.
that is optional. We don't necessarily advertise that it's optional,
Mhm.
and it's an effort to try and collect that data through different means. But I would argue that we're over testing our kids for sure.
I think so. I mean, I am very grateful for our daughter's teachers this year. They are amazing. Like, I tell them all the time, they probably think I'm a little stalkerish, but I don't care because we've had bad teachers before. So when we get good ones, I'm like, thank you, thank you, thank you. And
Mhm.
I think they're overwhelmed. Okay,
Oh, yeah.
they have too much testing, too many children. There are too many kids in the classroom. They're overburdened. They're working too many hours. They have too many responsibility, and the testing is ludicrous,
Yeah.
absolutely ludicrous. And they're putting so much pressure on the teachers to make sure that they're, getting the testing done, the scores are high. They, in turn, not all of them, and not necessarily my daughter's teachers, that my daughter doesn't feel that way at all. But I know there are other students that they feel that same pressure coming from, the admin or staff down to the teacher and then down to the student. And that the kids are starting to freak out on some of these exams. And it's like, what are you doing to these kids, in second, third, fourth, fifth grade, to make them feel this way? It's a test that they will not remember years to come. It's more important for the district than it is for the individual child, for that test. And I really feel for those teachers. I really do, because they work
I
really hard.
And I think you hit the nail on the head on many of those fronts. And, something that a lot of, the listeners may not realize is that the Board of Education at the state level changed the fine requirements for class size amendment rules.
Mm,
And this was done about a year ago. And so previously, we have class size amendment that is set for every grade level.
mm,
And when the Board of Education removed any sort of disciplinary fine when a
mm,
school district is over that ratio,
mm.
there's no accountability now to that state statute. Not that there necessarily was a lot of accountability prior,
Right.
but now there's none.
And I
And
wondered about that.
yes. And when I've brought this up to the district previously, I've continuously been told that the different allocations and enrollments and the ratios will level out as the year goes on. But I can tell you that there are still 35 kindergartners
Yeah.
in some of our schools. And
Mm,
while we have kindergarten instructional assistants,
yeah.
those
For this year only.
for this year going away next year. They are being
Yes.
cut.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of moving pieces into what's impacting our class sizes.
Mhm.
And I would really like to see the powers that be dig into that and figure out solutions. I think there's more we can be doing to really address that. And it would also help us keep teachers in our county.
I think it goes back to planning, and I have reached out as a concerned parent to our district, especially the planning department, and said, "Hey, there. This was over the summer. And in our daughter's third grade classroom, there were like 30 kids, which is too many. And I reached out to the planning department. They told me there weren't. I'm like, no, there were 30 kids. And they basically were trying to call me a liar. Now, I didn't say on the phone, and I could have, and later on I did think about it, but there's something called a yearbook. And I didn't take their yearbook class picture. So they couldn't have manufactured it. And there were more than the number of children that were supposed to be in that classroom per the statutes in her classroom. And I found it very narrow-minded, short-sighted, and condescending when I spoke to that person on the phone, and he told me, basically called me a liar. Okay, no. Why don't you investigate what I'm talking about and come up with a solution instead of just trying to off-put a parent? I just it rubbed me the wrong way, and it made me definitely concerned about, how things are going and how things are being planned. And
Yeah.
again, it's not everyone, but that particular individual was high enough within the planning department that it made gave me pause for concern.
Yeah, and I can tell you I'm 99% sure of exactly who you're speaking of. And,
Interesting.
I've had a similar experience,
Mm.
when I addressed essentially how we're just even building our schools, because
Yes.
my children's school, they have been in 16 portables, and they've been there for 17 years. And when I've brought that to the attention of the district several times, we consistently go back to what's called the average daily measurement. And the average daily measurement
Hmm.
is what is used to predict enrollment. However, I can tell you that the calculations that they use are only for single family housing units. Now, we have
Course,
families
we
that
have
live
no
in
apartments.
apartments.
There are no apartments where we are at all. None, there are
No,
none, and they're not building
none,
anymore.
right? Mhm. And so when I tried to address this issue, especially because we know that when there's a housing crisis,
Yeah.
more families are living in apartments because it is more financially sound for them.
Mm,
So when you look at certain areas of our county that are well established, their
mm,
estimations for enrollment are pretty accurate. However, when you look in areas that were built within the last 7 to 10 years, there's a variation between 27 to 39% between estimated and actual enrollment year over year. That's a problem.
yeah, so it rubbed me the wrong way, and it didn't give me it wasn't the best impression for that department, and, since then, I've not bothered reaching back out again because I know the kind of response that was from that person, and again, that person is relatively high up within the planning
Mhm.
department, so I'm like, "Nothing's going to change." They had no intention of doing anything different, which is sad because at the
Yeah.
end of the day, it affects our kids.
Yes, and I think in general, we have a serious problem with dismissing parents and concerned residents. And we do it in such a way that it is intentionally discouraging to silence them in the future, in my opinion, having really just gone through it as a parent. And that is something that I think back to quite often as someone who has taught here and continues to teach and having a master's in education and everything else. If you are trying to present information in that way to me, thinking that you can pull the wool over my eyes, what is it like for the average parent who doesn't have that same experience in education or even the institutional knowledge of the region that we live in?
Yeah.
And, it's interesting too how much we see, you know, bureaucratic sort of kicking the can back and forth because that same planning department, they have several employees who sit on the planning commission for the county,
Mm.
and they will consistently blame the county commissioners, and the county commissioners will blame the school board when in reality they actually work very closely together. And so that is another problem I see is, why are we sending parents and concerned residents, on a wild goose chase rather than saying, you know what, I hear you. And 30 kids in a classroom is too much. And I want you to know that I might not have a perfect solution right here and now,
Mm.
but we're working on it. And I would love to stay in contact with you so that we
Mm.
can work on it together. How different of a conversation that would be.
Right.
And Our district continuously states that we don't have community engagement. I don't think that that's true. I think that we have a lot of community engagement.
I've been
It's
engaged.
just that yes, it's just that we make a concerted effort to not engage them, and that's a problem.
I definitely think that's the problem. And actually, going to the next question is, how do you work with, and we're talking about the district, but how do you work with the district effectively as a parent when you don't, again, we don't know all the statutes and laws. Now, over the summer, I became well versed on several of them because I had to be.
Yeah.
Um, but the average parent isn't going to take that time to do that. How do you work with the district? How do you work with admin? How do you work with staff? Now, those are three different buckets. So the district, in my experience, it has been knowing the right person to get information from. So having to do the research to find out who they are, getting their email address, and then for me to know the statutes and laws to the best that I can, because I'm not an attorney, and then
Mhm.
be able to say, "Hey, I don't think this is right," but direct that question to the right person.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I think is the most accessible for parents to do is to
Mhm.
document.
Mhm.
Document, document, document. And what I mean by that is if you see a problem, if you see something like, hey, I don't think that this is fair to kids, whether
Mhm.
it's your child, whether it's an entire classroom, even if it's something as simple as facilities. And I bring that up because so many of our schools don't have consistently working air condition and people
This
don't
is Florida, y'all.
right. It gets hot. It gets very
Mm.
hot. And so I bring up that piece of documentation because even if you might not know the statute, even if you might not know the exact person to talk to, if you
Mhm.
have a picture, if you have a screenshot of an email or whatever it is that you are concerned about, and
Mhm.
making sure that that is documented in email,
Mhm.
not just a phone call,
Mhm.
it is going to at least trigger some concern, whether
Mhm.
that is school site staff, district level staff, because oftentimes they're going to come back and say, just like you said, oh, there's not 30 kids in the class. And it's like, really, I can see it with my eyes and I actually know how to count to 30, right? So, I think when we come back to facts are facts,
Yeah.
that's really what it comes down to. And I also think letting parents know you're not crazy when it comes to the concerns that you have and what you're seeing. And I think that that's a big one because parents doubt themselves so much.
Mhm.
And they're also concerned because they know that we're dealing with a major staff shortage. So
Mhm.
they don't want to make things necessarily harder for their school site staff. They
Mhm.
really want the district to step in and
Mhm.
provide that required support.
I agree. And so when you do work with the school and the staff and the admins, if there is a positive thing, it's so easy to, talk to them. But when there's a negative thing, when you don't agree with them, at what point do you involve the next level? Like, okay, so you say you're having a problem with your daughter's teacher, which I have not had a problem with my daughter's teachers at all this year. Thank God. Thank God. They were phenomenal. But say that or your son's teacher, let's say your kid's teacher, whatever, you have a problem with the teacher. At what point do you escalate it? When do you escalate it to the district? Or if you have to go to the Florida Department of Education, what are the steps? Or if you have to go to the school board or the county commissioners, what's the best way of doing that? Um, because at some point you're going to be labeled a problem parent
Mhm.
even if you are right,
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
school will just kind of shut down responding to you. What point do you escalate it, and when do you get involved? And hopefully, you wouldn't have to get an attorney, but I know some parents have had to do
Yeah.
that.
They have. They
Oh,
have saying things like, okay, well, I hear that you don't think this is a problem, but it is. And you have the opportunity as the person in power to create change. And you have an opportunity to grow and shift the culture of your school and expectations in that classroom. And so either you're going to rise to the occasion or you're not. But as a parent, I need to know what you're going to do because if this is not addressed, then it will have to be escalated. And as you know, I'm a very direct person. And I don't mind if I am portrayed or depicted as the problem, because if I'm speaking up for those who may not be able to speak up for themselves or know how, I have no issue doing that. But I think that you raise a really big concern in terms of how do you know when it's appropriate to do that? And I think, there's two that I find that are really glaring. One, is there a safety issue?
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes people don't realize certain situations that are really a safety issue. Having a large class size is a major safety issue. We just simply, we can only look so many different ways within a classroom to make sure that all students are safe. And that becomes even more difficult when we're doing different activities where kids are up and moving, or if we're out at recess or transitioning. The other piece is, are we creating barriers to the child's learning, right?
Mm,
There are
mhm,
naturally barriers that exist, whether that child has unique abilities, whether they might have some sort of past trauma, whether, maybe their socioeconomic status makes it really difficult for them to focus on their learning, right? But we
mhm,
should not, as a school district, be doing things that worsen or create barriers.
mhm,
And, some really simple things that, I've noticed over the last couple years as the shortage continues to increase
mhm,
and our class sizes continue to increase is students with an IEP or 504
mhm,
that have preferential seating,
mm,
or they require a repeat of instruction that's on
mhm,
one-to-one, checking
mhm,
in with that student to say, hey, I just gave the whole class instructions. Do you know what you're supposed to be doing or working on right now? Can
mhm,
I help you with that?
mhm.
Part of what's happening for our kids that are sort of in the middle of the road, right? They're not
Yeah,
our super high level kids.
yeah.
They're not maybe our super, kids that are maybe a grader level two behind, but right in the middle. They're not causing major behavioral problems.
Mhm,
And they might have that IEP or 504, but the teacher is trying to address three, four, five students that do have major behavioral concerns.
mhm,
And so those kids are getting the bulk of the attention.
mhm,
And sometimes parents don't even realize that how much of a disservice it is to their child who is right in the middle of the road. They don't realize that, maybe their child is coasting along, but they're not actually growing. They're not really learning. They're not actually being challenged in the ways that would help them excel. Does that
mm.
make sense?
Yeah.
And so I feel like if you have either two of those in terms of safety, or there's true barriers to your child's learning, those are
Mhm,
the two biggest things that as parents we should be absolutely fine with speaking up. And if
mhm,
the problem truly is not addressed, escalating that to the next person. Always start with your classroom teacher if you can. And if you have a good rapport, build that rapport as much as you can.
mhm,
If that's not working, reach out to your school site administration. If that doesn't work, reach out to the district level. And if
mhm,
that doesn't work, reach out to the Department of Education.
mhm,
Do what you need to do for your child,
mhm.
and don't hesitate to do that.
I agree. We've had to do that several times this year. I'm smiling, but I'm not happy about what happened. But I have to be an advocate for our daughter. My husband and I
Yeah.
have to be, because I unfortunately, I don't know how this is going to come across, but it's the truth. I can't trust the administration at our school to have my daughter's best interest in mind. They have shown and proven continuously, in my opinion, and I feel that they have done that several times where they are not that concerned. Again, thank God for our daughter's teachers that they have made her feel as comfortable as they can in the classroom. Our daughter is thriving because of the support she gets at home, and because we continually encourage her to be her best self, no matter what the circumstances are. But we have definitely had to speak up and advocate at the administration level within the school, and also within the district, because of circumstances and because they were not doing the right things. But thank God, again, I did read some of those statutes and I did read some of those laws, and we didn't back down because we were right and they were wrong.
Mm.
And there
And
are parents that just they don't. or they're afraid to, or, I was concerned, speaking of like backlash or retaliation, I was concerned when I did speak up, how will that affect my daughter at school? You know,
Mhm.
and some
Yep.
of the language that came across in the emails, when we did speak up, I noticed it had changed, using words like your daughter instead of her name. You know her name,
Mm.
you know
Mhm.
her nickname, but using the phrasing your daughter. So at that point, I know she is no longer someone you are really concerned with. You
'Cause
are
you feel
just
like there's a
concerned with,
disassociation there.
oh yeah.
Gotcha.
Right. But
Mhm.
we did speak up, and I'm glad we did.
Yeah, and I think too, one of the aspects, like, again, it's gonna be different from every school
Mhm,
site to school site,
mhm,
and having worked with, so many of our administrators and teachers here in the county, it also surprises me at times when we don't employ what we know to be best educational practice. And part of that is because of the shortage. However, you should still be informing parents of that. As the administrator or as the teacher, you might say, "Hey, I can see that this is what your child needs. I know that it's within their IEP. I understand the situation. I want you to know as a school, here's where we're at, here's what we're able to provide, and
mhm,
document it." Because in my opinion, it's not even necessarily always the school site that might be liable for that lack of access. It might be other systems that have been created. And one thing that I can share in that regard is previously we had exceptional student education case managers. We still have them, but
mhm,
the allocation or amount on each campus was reduced.
mhm,
So one is now focused just on paperwork, while the other one is focused on providing services.
mhm,
This was a change that just took place in the last 2 years. It's
mhm,
not even something that administrators can control within their school.
mhm.
And because of their position, they're not going to come to you as a parent and say, this was the district, this was not our decision. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily what happened.
Yeah, that was not our that's not what
Right.
happened. I do know other people where their IEP was not being followed, and some other people's 504s weren't being followed. That was not the problem, the issue with our child. Ours was completely different than that, but yeah, that is going on.
And my point there is that regardless of what position that we are in as an employee, we need to be able to have those honest conversations,
Yeah,
because if we're not having honest conversations, we can't find solutions.
and I
Yep.
get that you wanna keep your rating. I get that. We would like you to keep your rating too, but the rating of the school should not be at the expense of the students.
Mhm.
So if
Yeah,
there are problems, you need to recognize them. You need to be truthful with yourselves and also truthful with the parents. You can't
right,
keep sweeping things under the rug and think they're going to go away. You're going to get a big mound under there, and people are going to be able to see that mound. So deal
right,
with it.
right,
Deal with the dirt.
right. And again, that's, being honest, addressing those solutions and finding a path forward, because we can't just pretend things that, aren't happening.
You have to. You have to. And so I hope that in the future with other people, um, that they do that, because
Mhm.
there are so many situations where they're not still. My other question for you would be, how do you support your child if they're not doing well in the classroom? Like, what should you, and that kind of goes back to advocating too, but how do you make sure you support your child if they're getting a D in math, or let's say they're getting a C in English? I mean, depending upon your home life, C might be okay for us. A C is not acceptable because we know the C is not her best. Now, if the C is your best, that's fine. But I know for my child, a C is not her best. How do you support your child to make sure they're getting the best education they can when they're faltering in a class?
So I think that, what we have to do as parents, we have to kind of go back and say, okay, what's the root of the problem here? And that root might be, if a child is earning a C or D in English, asking yourself, okay, are they dyslexic? Is there something that is a huge barrier there? And
Mhm,
asking ourselves, is this being also presented in a way that is accessible for students? And I'll give you like a quick example. So, within my son's program and how they sort of split up their teaching responsibilities, a lot of what happens in our district is that things are decided as a team.
Mhm.
And now they share resources and they collaborate, and that's wonderful.
Mhm.
However, we also know that lessons are not a one size fits all for the individual teacher
Yep.
or for those students.
Yep.
And you might have a teaching team where a specific lesson or unit is being technically taught the same way, but the way that the teacher is able to interact with it and present it to the students is completely different.
Yep.
And so I can tell you, there was an example where the kids were doing a novel study within their humanities block. There
Mhm.
was one teacher who was playing the audio book in the course for the students to follow along with. There weren't really supplemental activities or pausing
Mhm.
for conversation or a lot of interaction with the text. So
Exactly.
when it came to the time for the end of the unit assessment, which was based off of this novel study, the
Mhm.
whole group of students did not do well in
Yep.
comparison to the other class where there was more interaction. There was a deeper element of learning. There was more conversation and there
Mhm.
was more writing that was happening. And
Mhm.
so when you look at that for whole classes and say, okay, and this is what we get into, and we call different tiers of instruction.
Mhm.
So, as a parent, obviously, you might not be thinking about all of these things,
Mhm.
but as simple as shooting an email and saying, "Hey, I noticed that, my child's grade dropped from an A last quarter to a C this quarter. Is there
Mhm.
something, within the material that has changed that they're struggling with?"
Mhm.
And here's a really big question:
Mhm.
is the entire class struggling with this?
Mhm.
Or is this something that is just my child?
Mhm.
Because sometimes kids also have learning gaps within the entire cohort. And so, meaning like their entire class.
Mhm.
And that can sometimes be from the previous year. Maybe there was teacher turnover. Maybe
Mhm.
they had a long term sub. And so we see that the entire class is struggling.
Mhm.
Or is this individual to my specific student? And
Mhm.
one of the things that I implement with my children as well is if they don't finish work in class, the
Mhm.
expectation is that they're going to come home and they're going to
Mhm.
finish it. Their
Mhm.
teachers will shoot me an email, let me know, which is great. I appreciate that. I know it's a little bit extra work on their part, but I think the first determination is this a whole class issue or is this a my child issue?
'Cause
And if
it like and that's a good way of saying that, is it because sometimes we just think it's just your kid, but sometimes it could be just the learning environment of the whole class.
yeah,
And I love that you said that because it's I don't usually think of it that way. I think, okay, my kid's not doing well in something, what's going on? And like she did not get a D or C. Is I never thought that not in her instance, but in other instances, is it the class? Could it be the teacher? Could it be the way that teacher is interpreting information or disseminating information? Could it be the classroom environment? Is there
mhm,
something going on in the class that's disrupting, learning?
yeah.
These are all things that could happen.
Yeah. And I'll say even, because I primarily throughout my career have taught freshmen and sophomores.
Yeah.
And, being a social studies teacher, there's a huge writing element.
Mhm.
And I would have kids that would come in one year and I'm like, whoa, they're blowing this out of the water.
Mhm.
And then the next year it's completely different. Same
Mhm.
school, same feeder pattern. And then I'll dig a little and I was like, oh, that eighth grade English teacher left that year and they had three long-term subs throughout the whole year.
Yeah.
And so they're walking in with completely different skills and ability.
Mhm.
And it's really important to have some of that background knowledge so that
Mhm.
as a parent, where you can step in and fill in those gaps so that
Yeah.
your child isn't falling further behind.
Another thing I would say is it's not embarrassing to get a tutor. We've had a tutor for our daughter for years only because the class sizes are too big and we want her to be able to ask questions. Now, we are fortunate enough to be able to afford a tutor for her and to get private lessons. Not everybody is. So I think some school systems, I don't know if ours does or not, where you can reach out and say, I need additional support. Again, you not expect the teacher to take additional time because they are overtaxed. And have limited resources, but sometimes a school can help provide or the county can help provide. I don't know about our county. money for you to be able to get a tutor. But I would say to parents, don't ever be embarrassed. Just because you get a tutor doesn't, like, our daughter does not need a tutor in math, but we keep a tutor so that she can continue to build that confidence. And if she has questions or she wants to study ahead, or we keep a tutor for
Mhm,
math.
mhm.
You should have no embarrassment because your daughter or son needs a tutor. In my day, because I am old, we didn't have them. You went to school, whatever grade you got, you got.
Mhm.
But I think that they're a great resource to have. And if you can't afford it, reach out to your school district to see if that one can be provided for you. And do not be embarrassed.
And
And
I
you don't
think
have to tell everybody either. It's not a business.
you bring up a huge point though, in terms of some of the gaps that we see within our communities in terms of, some of the schools that I've worked in that are Title One, they might be a C or even a D school. And knowing the staff, I can see that the staff is absolutely phenomenal and doing everything that they can, but the kids have so much other stuff outside of
Environmental factors.
right, those environmental factors. And sometimes it's simply, something as simple as, well, the older sibling takes care of the younger siblings while the parents are working. And so they have less time for a tutor or homework or things like that, or parents can't afford a tutor. And so you have to ask yourself sometimes, is that school grade of an A or a C really indicative of the school? Or is it indicative of everything else going on surrounding that school?
Yep, I agree. I agree. Our again, our school has an A. The A, I think, is just reflective of the test scores, but it's not reflective of what the school truly is.
Gotcha. And I've worked in, both A, C, D schools, and I will say it really is not the best indicator of what staff is really putting forward. And, I think that if that is something that parents, really understood, I think would be a huge game changer in terms of even what we see like on our school choice applications.
Yeah, because I know that for our school, lots of people want to come here. It's like, but why do you want to come here? Is this going to be the best environment for your child? Do you know what you're getting into? And going back to the beginning of the interview, we were saying you're asking these questions. What about the culture? Is this a good fit for your kid? If they looked into that and just saying, oh, it's an A, it may not be the best fit for your child. And at that point, you need to look elsewhere. So in our community, there are a lot of people actually leaving the school
Wow.
because it's just, I call it mass exodus. This year literally is a mass exodus. There are teachers and parents who just said enough is enough. And it's an A school, but then why are we
You
all
have another
leaving?
good point. We live in very similar, neighborhoods,
Mhm.
master plan communities, and we have the same issue in terms of we're an A school, but we now have portables on campus. They've tried to build an additional wing, and there are a lot of teachers who have left, are leaving this year, and a lot and this there's one particular story I'll tell you that really kind of blew the cap off the top of my head this year. And it was a very close personal friend and has been teaching in our schools for 17 years.
Yeah,
And their child just went through some major medical issues over the last 2 years. And seeing her just fight tooth and nail trying to advocate for him and how dedicated she's been to our schools over the years. And she came to me and just very upset. And, she said, we're leaving. She said, I'm sorry. I'm
yeah,
taking him to a private school.
yeah,
We're going to apply, for the voucher. And she kept apologizing.
yeah,
And I was like, you don't have to apologize. Like, I understand both the guilt that you feel, feeling like, you're sad that you have to walk away from something that you have spent quite literally your life building up. But at
yeah,
the end of the day, your child needs help here and now.
yeah,
And we can't wait as parents 5, 10 years for the system to fix itself.
no,
We must act now in doing what's best for our kids. And I can't blame the teachers that are leaving either. In many ways, I feel that they're almost in an abusive relationship, you
right.
know? And like you stay because of and myself included, there's
Mhm.
probably like this element of almost Stockholm syndrome, It's like you feel like if you just keep putting yourself on the back burner and you keep giving it all that you have, then we'll be able to make that difference for kids and be able to overcome all these institutional barriers. But I think we're kind of at a breaking point.
We are. I
Mhm.
know so many people,
Yeah.
so many people who are looking at other, and they're not going to another public school. Nope. They're
Yeah.
going to private, possibly charter, possibly,
Yeah.
and remote learning
Hmm.
because it's just,
Yeah. And
you've got to a point where you're like, they're not going to change, so I need to change.
yeah, and again, I don't think that, there's a lot of people who will universally speak negatively about charters and privates, but again, I don't think it's a one size fits all. And there's people who will universally speak negatively about public, but it really depends on that administration, that staff, that specific school culture. And there are some that, will leave the public system and they are beautifully happy. They made a great choice. And then you have others who realize it might not have been the best choice, that the school was not able to provide or deliver on all of the promises. And so, with anything, it's a big decision.
Mhm,
Do your due diligence, ask those, really important questions. And the other thing that parents don't realize that they can do, and it's not necessarily at every school, but kids can also go and do a shadow day. They can,
yes.
attend a school and they can figure out like how they feel, what's the vibe? Do I think that this is going to be good for me? And they have those options, which I think is also really important. I think that that is going to contribute ultimately to even wider educational gaps.
Mhm,
One of the biggest things we've really struggled with, and this is, again, a universal struggle, are the issues with consistent transportation.
mm,
We,
yeah.
yeah, when it comes to late busing that never shows up and things like that. And then you're talking about potentially switching your child. Well, that means that your child's now going to be a car rider.
Yep,
And that means that a parent needs to be available to make that happen. And that's not possible for, dual working families. And, I think that those are other things that as an overall system, we don't talk about enough that
yep.
are very legitimate barriers for families.
I would say also, and this is kind of a little bit different. Not, I agree with what you're saying. There are definitely barriers to education, especially when it comes to transportation. We're very fortunate that we could literally walk to school. A lot of kids in our neighborhoods golf cart to school. They also ride their bikes. They do scooters. So we're very, very fortunate. Involvement. I would say, as a parent, don't just complain. You need to be involved. And our family was extremely involved. you know, we know everyone from the principal to the teachers to the janitors. I know literally probably about everybody at that school, or at least 95%. So if you're going to complain about your child's school, how involved were you? Were you just complaining, 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 or were you trying to ask good questions and actually invoke change in a positive way? Now, positive way can be perceived differently. If you ask questions behind closed doors, don't get answers, and then you take it to social media and don't get answers, and then you still keep asking, you're going to be perceived one way
Hmm. Yeah.
versus just asking questions between your neighbors and not doing anything else. That's not really invoking change. If you want something to change, try and invoke the change, and then if nothing happens, then okay, go someplace else. We were involved. We volunteered. So we were involved. I did volunteer. We were on. I did the PTO thing. We gave money. We did fundraising. We hosted parties. We did all of that. So for someone to say, well, you weren't involved, no, I was very involved. I
Hmm.
did ask questions behind closed doors. I did send emails and I was vocal. I did go to school board meetings. I did all that. And at the end of the day, I found they like it that way.
Mm. That's
But
tough.
that doesn't work.
And I think that, the more that parents kind of understood maybe some of those inner workings, the more we would all be able to work on, real tangible solutions. But I completely agree with you, in terms of that involvement. And it's something that I would also like to see better facilitated within our county. Um, a couple of years ago, I had a hard time getting on our volunteer list. And yeah, I was like, I've been a certified teacher with our state for a long time. Like, why? I don't understand." And then I found out that none of the volunteers had been approved. And this was in November, right? And it was due to, an issue at like district level and yada yada. But every year, parents have to reapply. They have to make sure that they, have made it on the volunteer list. Whereas from my perspective, I really think that we need to do more to better just improve that process
Mhm.
and create more programs where our parents are on campus more, whether it's reading to kids, offering math tutoring, whatever the case may be, whether it's, garden beautification, we need more of that parental involvement. And I know that we have parents who are invested, who want to be doing those things, but they feel like, and not even that they feel, there are barriers to making that happen. You
Yeah,
know,
I just don't understand. Again, we came from a different state, and there was a problem in our daughter's school 2 years ago. The same situation happened there that it did here, and the responses were mind-bogglingly different. The
mm,
school where we came from, it was taken care of expeditiously. Like, they listened to the parents, they believed the parents, they investigated it, and it was stopped.
mhm,
This school,
yeah. And
I
and
had to escalate.
right. And I
I'm not
can
the only one.
only And I can only imagine that's related to bullying.
Yes, it
Yeah.
was.
And the reason why I say that is because I think that we have a serious issue in terms of apathy toward bullying.
Mhm.
And I personally feel like it's a major problem, especially when we also have a zero tolerance policy when it comes to student altercations, because oftentimes we will see kids who finally kind of get to their breaking point because they have been bullied so badly.
Yeah,
Parents have tried to intervene, they've tried to go to admin, and the problem isn't changing. And so then finally, that child gets hit or pushed or whatever, and they defend themselves after months of being kind of, emotionally and mentally beaten into the ground. And now
yeah.
both of those kids are suspended. Personally,
Wait,
I don't think
no,
that that is fair whatsoever. And
no.
I also think that there's much more that we could be doing for bullying on social media. I
And
don't even think that kids should have access to social media at school, especially.
in our daughter's case, it wasn't bullying on social media, it was bullying within the classroom or on the school premises, I'll just say the school premises. I won't even say the classroom, the school premises. And, one of the responses was, well, it wasn't bullying because they're friends. Have you never heard of domestic violence, honey?
Yeah.
What
Sometimes
the
friends
heck?
end up being the worst bullies of all because they know the most about you.
And it didn't make any sense. Again, when we had the same thing happen, not the same thing, but a similar instance at another school years ago, they were like, what happened? Oh, let's find out about that quickly. And they did. And it
Mhm.
was handled expeditiously.
Yeah. And that's kind of what I mean is that I think we let these emotional issues really fester, and
Mhm.
then we sort of try to overcorrect when then it comes to a physical point and it comes to that headway. And we've got to start addressing it out the gate. We can't let those things fester. And I would love to see more focus on character development than test scores. I think if we really set the standard for what we expect in terms of mutual respect, both amongst the student body, amongst staff, amongst everyone, parents, I think that it would be a game changer.
And in terms of mutual respect, it's interesting. You'll have parents that say, at least where I live, not all, but enough of them will say, well, what you said to so and so wasn't right. I spoke the truth. I spoke it firmly.
Yes.
If so and so didn't like it, that's too bad. But if so and so is doing something that's wrong, immoral, fraudulent, goes against the rules, You're more fine with that than me calling it out.
That's a problem. That's unfortunate. And that's why, we have to have accountability and boundaries. We have to.
And
And
I really don't understand. Why are they not, and they don't address, this is, like, kind of off topic. They're not addressing the bullying issues, not just within our school. I know it's school after school after school. They just
yeah.
aren't addressing them correctly. And saying that you have a zero tolerance policy is a crock of crap because because it's continuing.
Right. And I think something, you again, like brought up, a great point in terms of we have to be able to have those honest conversations and we have to be able to professionally and respectfully call out problems for what they are. If it quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, it's a duck.
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
I've seen those ducks. They
Yes.
walk the line right to the school. Going back to education, our time is over, and I really appreciate it. So, y'all, if you're looking for a different school system, don't just leave just because you don't like the teacher, you don't like the admin. Try and work with them. I mean, our daughter's school is full of amazing teachers that I really care about, and I would do. There are several of them. If they needed something, I would go to bat in an instant, and I have told them that. But make sure that you're involved. Don't be that parent that is annoying about silly things. And you define silly, that's subjective. But like Jessica said, safety issues. Yes, you should absolutely advocate for your child about safety issues, things like bullying, um, class size. You should advocate about that. But there are some issues that you really just don't need to advocate about. Make sure you know your child. That's the biggest thing when you are in the school system. Know your child. Get to know the teachers. Volunteer if you can. If you can't, find out why you can't. There could be that the
Yes.
list hasn't been approved because
Yeah.
there's a shortage of staff.
Right.
But get involved in your school. Get involved in a positive way. Again, that can be subjective. Sometimes when you raise concerns, all of a sudden you aren't looked at very positively. Keep going because that just might be what they need to help course correct. And if you're finding that they're not course correcting, if they do not want it to change, then you have to make the difficult decision on how you can change what's best for your kid. Because continuing to put your child in a system where they are being harmed mentally, physically, emotionally is not going to be in their best interest long term.
Yeah,
It just won't be. And you
absolutely.
and your child will have to deal with what that later on, and that's not something you want to have to do. Anything
Absolutely.
else you'd like to say on this topic of education from the perspective of a parent, dealing with administration or teachers or advocating or being a mom?
I mean, honestly, just thank you so much. And I think that, these are very complex issues and topics. And I don't think that there's, a correct answer for all of them. It really comes down to a lot of individual issues and problems, but there are universal things that we can do to improve situations. And so thank you so much for your time. And it was really a pleasure chatting as always.
Love you, Jess. Love you, love you. You know I do. Thanks for joining me here today, and we'll talk more about education maybe in a couple more months and get some more perspectives from other parents who have had to go from public to private or private to public, how they did it, why they did it, and also the financing to accompany that. Talk to y'all
All
soon.
right. Thank
Bye.